So today I'm going to share a little bit about our experiences with the project. It's called SPIN, Scleroderma Patient-Centered Intervention Network. And we're using the CMRCT design, or the TWIX design, in multiple centers in multiple countries. And we're still growing because actually this talk could now be called 39 ethics committees in 5 countries. And I'll just walk you through our experiences with that. So the short answer is it a challenge? No, not really. And you may be surprised to hear that, but it wasn't as bad as we had expected it to be. But please don't leave the room because I do have something more to tell you today. So the Scleroderma Patient-Centered Intervention Network is a multi-center study on scleroderma, and I'm going to explain just a little bit about what that is. And you'll see the acronym in French and in Spanish. I don't actually speak either of those languages, so I can't really tell you what it stands for. But the English is the Scleroderma Patient-Centered Intervention Network. So what is scleroderma? Those of you who are doctors may know, but it's a rare disease that causes hard skin and tightening of the skin that is due to fibrosis or collagen buildup in the skin. But this can also occur in the internal organs. It's rare. There's approximately 1,500 patients in the Netherlands, and that makes it a challenge for research. And I've just shown the tight skin and the hand function problems that people experience. Some of the body image concerns due to changes in appearance, smaller mouth, smaller nose, but also the telangiectasia, the small dilated blood vessels in the face. And here, this is a picture of lung involvement. And I'm a psychologist, so I can't actually really tell you what you can see here, but this is a picture showing the lung involvement from. So the treatment of scleroderma is really complex. There's a lot of different symptoms. It's very heterogeneous, and there's no cure for it today. So the treatment focuses on a reduction of symptoms, improving physical function and quality of life, and maintaining quality of life as well as possible. So there's a real potential for non-pharmacological interventions, so psychological interventions, rehabilitation interventions, physical therapy, occupational therapy, etc. And actually, if you look at other more common chronic diseases, this is really a standard of care. So in addition to medications and other treatments, people with more common diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or diabetes often have access to physical therapy, psychological or supportive care, psychoeducation, etc., but not in rare diseases. This is what I just said. It's typically not available in rare diseases, especially there's no programs that are specific to the disease, or specific to scleroderma, or any of the other almost 7,000 rare diseases that exist, or they're not even adequately tested to see if they're useful or not. And the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. So why is it so hard to develop and maintain and test an intervention in rare diseases? Well, there's simply not enough patients in a single center to maintain a program like that. And also not enough patients to conduct large enough trials to test the effectiveness of the interventions. And then if you think about healthcare providers in local settings, they often see 1 or maybe 2 patients with scleroderma over their whole career, their whole lifetime. So what is SPIN? Well, SPIN is exactly aiming to address this gap. So we want to develop psychosocial and rehabilitation interventions that are specific to scleroderma, but also that are accessible and that can be sustained over the long run. Because what we don't want to do is get money for a trial. Well, we obviously do want to get money for a trial, but we don't want to get money for a trial that we run in a single center, small study. And then when the funding runs out, we have to fold up shop, and this intervention is not available to people with scleroderma anymore. So that's what we do not want to do. So we want to develop a sustainable infrastructure to be able to deliver the care to people with scleroderma, but also an infrastructure to do trials of these interventions over time. And I highlighted multiple high-quality trials of interventions because that's why I'm sticking with the CMRCT design, and I haven't really switched the acronym to TWIX yet, because the multiple is really important. So how are we doing that? There's a couple of key components in SPIN, these 4. So first of all, we have a very strong partnership with patient organizations from all over the world. And James and I were discussing a little bit yesterday about how funding agencies now require that you collaborate with patient organizations or patient advocates. And that's something that SPIN has really done from the beginning. Actually, the Scleroderma Society of Canada funded a research assistant to put together this network before we even applied for funding. So a strong partnership. And this is all the logos of people who we're working with. And patients are represented in SPIN's steering committee that also consists of researchers and physicians, psychologists, etc. And there's a patient advisory board. And when we first started to put together this project, we asked them what they thought about the CMRCT design. We explained to them what the plans were of doing, and we asked them whether it would be understandable to themselves, but also whether they thought it would be understandable to other patients who may be enrolling in our cohort. Yes, they did understand it, and they very much liked the design. And this is just anecdotal evidence for that. And I know that the next speaker will have more structured data on what patients think of the CMRCT design. Why did they like it so much? Well, there's no disappointment for the people who are not able to access the intervention because the control group is not told about the intervention. They liked it because it's a sustainable framework, or at least that's what we hope it will be, for multiple trials. Because one single trial of an intervention doesn't address the range of problems that people with scleroderma experience. So really, this multiple trial facility and being able to enroll enough patients to assess the effectiveness was really important to them. So basically doing what no one else has been able to do, because there's really no adequately powered trials in any of the 7,000 rare diseases of psychosocial and rehabilitation interventions. And then the other thing, and I just mentioned it in one of my comments, the ethical alternative wasn't really an option to them. So basically, they didn't want us to go around calling patients, telling them that there may be an intervention, but they are not going to be able to access it. So some challenges with the CMRCT design that we have faced. So one of them is that some patients are in our cohort we started enrolling in 2014, and they're in our cohort for over 2 years, and they're experiencing SPIN cohort fatigue. So they're basically done filling out these measures every 3 months. And some of them withdraw, and some of them say, well, I see that I need to continue doing this because of its purpose. So one of the questions is, how long can someone be in a cohort before your trial starts?
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
With respect to my speeches,
Mm-hmm.
I guess they fill in these questionnaires, and what happens? Are they on paper? Are they online? What happens to that information?
They fill them out online, and we have exactly the opposite of what you presented yesterday, because we actually had to put in a disclaimer that we won't be looking at their individual data, because otherwise we would be obliged to follow up on high distress patients, etc. So that is one of the issues that definitely contributes to it.
There's another way you can do it, and this is something that we've worked with in some other rare disease groups, is that website. Okay, if you can't give them clinical care, you can give them something else. Mm-hmm. So for example, there's a website in the US called Patients Like Me that a lot of my colleagues call Patients Unlike Me, because it has no good stats in it. But patients will certainly, be on that all weekends, typing their details and telling you on average how I'm average. So one of the things you can do, if they're typing stuff into a website, is say, compare yourself with similar patients, or how many men of your age are like this, and then you can actually put advice on the website. So you've reported a lot of this symptom. Have you spoken to your doctor about whatever?
So some kind of feedback that helps them
with their care. If they don't see it as a valuable, so that patients will go on websites and they will type in their data and so on and so forth, and the fatigue that they get eventually, if they don't, in some groups, what's been reported is that they don't want to keep thinking of themselves as a patient. Right? Every day I log on and it's a big thing saying you're a patient, you're sick, and they kind of want to get away from that. But if you're asking them to do it every few months.
Every 3 months.
Okay, I don't think you're going to get that, right? So if every 3 months they get an email, log on, and then, we're going to tell something. There's something in Netflix. Netflix? Do you know what Netflix is?
Yeah, I know.
All right, Netflix. I don't know if it's just the US or not, but it says, rate 2 films, and we'll tell you 3 others you'll like. And that's how they get, billions of ratings to help them run a better business. It's the same. You can incentivize patients and say this is in your own best interest. Fill in a form and we'll give you something without necessarily that.
Yeah, that's a good idea, and it's definitely something that we should think about. So one of the things that we did, we actually removed some questionnaires from the assessments, and I'll get back to that later because we weren't sure that we were going to use the data. So we're just reducing the burden of completing the questionnaires. We're actually also put, when people log in to our cohort platform online, they see a news message. So we're trying to keep them up to date of what we're doing with their data, what is happening, where we give presentations, and we're also trying to do that in patient magazines. Because when we first started this project, we actually asked our patient advisory board, like, should we give incentives to people who complete the questionnaires? Should we send them Starbucks vouchers or anything? And they were like, not really. The only thing that would keep us really engaged in this research is to tell us what you're doing with our data and how this is advancing science and healthcare. The other thing that we encountered in terms of the patient's perspective, or we're presenting a lot at patient conferences and we're publishing in patient magazines. We can't actually speak about the 4 interventions that we are developing. So we cannot tell them that we're developing a hand exercise intervention, an emotional distress intervention, a self-management intervention, and an intervention that addresses body image concerns. You may ask yourself why, but it's because the control group should not be aware of the interventions that we are testing. So we try to address it by describing a range of interventions that we could actually be doing in the future, and that includes hand function problems and all the other interventions that we are currently developing. But it's been a challenge because they're very close partners, the patient organizations and the patients who we're working with, and yet we have to balance the amount of information that we can disclose to them. There's an international network of clinical research centers around the world, and I'll speak a little bit about that later as well. And we're developing virtually delivered interventions. These are really self-guided programs where patients log on, they get information on coping with hand function problems, and they'll actually get to see some videos on hand exercises. The other one is disease self-management, so coping with fatigue, coping with pain, coping with emotions. And there's an emotional distress intervention and an intervention for appearance-related concerns. And the reason that they're all self-guided is that as soon as you have to pay for a therapist to be doing this intervention, when your funding runs out, the question is who's going to pay for this therapist, and will patients still be able to access the intervention? So this is a very first step in making something accessible to people with scleroderma. So, and then the fourth component, obviously, is the CMRCT design that we're using. So how does this work in practice? A physician at one of the 39 centers completes a medical data form, very basic form with information that they can get from the medical chart. Once they submit that, it initiates patient enrollment in the cohort. Obviously, this is after patients have provided consent. And then the patients get an email with a question to complete outcome measures online every 3 months. And you may ask yourself, well, why did you pick 3 months? That's quite often to do that. And that's because in the end, for our interventions, our primary outcome will be 3 months after randomization. So we need to have this time frame to be able to collect trial outcomes of both the intervention group as well as the control group, who will not be aware that they are in a trial. And we're using this data, the observational data, to get more insight into problems that patients are experiencing, as well as validation of questionnaires and other measurement-related studies. We also spoke yesterday about how the TWIX design, or the CMRCT design, and the Zealand design are related. I just put in this slide from 2 years ago when we had this symposium. This is the single consent Zealand design. And basically what we are doing, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details later, is we're asking people to consent for the procedure of the Zealand design up front. So as soon as they enroll in the cohort, we're telling them exactly what we're going to do. We're disclosing when they will be notified about certain steps that we're taking and when they will not be notified. So I call this a consented Zealand design. Just to add to a little bit of the language.
Sorry, how is it different from the stage informed consent?
It's not, I don't think.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, it is, because in the stage informed consent, patients can consent only to participate in a cohort and to have their observational data collected without the choice of consent.
Okay.
And here you cannot participate in a cohort, right?
Right.
If you do not consent to the
Yeah, that's right. I'll get to that too. So this is just some text, and this is a lot of text on this slide, but this is part of our informed consent form. So we basically say that we'll be using the SPIN cohort data for three things. One is in the aggregate as an observational design. The other thing is to determine if we have an intervention that patients are eligible for at a certain point. And the other thing is the third component is that we'll ask the permission to compare the results of the questionnaires in the control group, people who are getting the intervention. And we're actually elaborating on that a little bit. Our consent form is very long, but we think it's important that all of this is in there. So again, this is a lot of text, but I've highlighted the most important parts. So currently, as part of your participation in the SPIN cohort, we ask your permission to provide your contact information to the central team based in Montreal. We invite you to complete a series of questionnaires related to problems important to people with scleroderma and use your data along with the data provided with other SPIN cohort participants in the aggregate for different studies that we'll be using your data for. And then it continues. In the future, once we have these online interventions, we ask your permission to use the responses of your questionnaire to determine if you're eligible for one of the interventions that we're developing. And we actually specifically say that only SPIN cohort participants who are selected to be offered the intervention will be contacted about the intervention. So that means that if you're in the control group, you won't hear about this. You're only providing consent to participate in the cohort at this time and not in the trial yet. And then the fifth point is that in the future, we ask your permission to use your responses in the SPIN cohort, on the SPIN cohort questionnaires in the control group. So 39 recruiting sites. This is just an overview of where they are located. They're located in the US, UK, France, and Mexico. Not yet in Nijmegen. I know it says it here, but we're still in the process of obtaining ethics there. So that's a mistake here. So we started enrollment in April 2014, and 2 years ago, I think we had about 300 patients in the cohort, and we're very proud. But we have 1,314 active patients right now, which means we enrolled a couple more than that. We have 246 withdrawals, and the reasons for people to withdraw is that they don't have time to complete these questionnaires. Many are too ill to participate or deceased at a certain point, or they do not have computer access. There's a couple of other reasons, but these are the most important ones. Patients complete their measures in English, French, or in Spanish. So 3 languages right now. We're working on the Dutch. We have Canada, the US, the UK, France, and Mexico. So 39 ethics committee that we've dealt with. Yeah, luckily not just me by myself. So here's a couple of experiences, and again, this is a lot of text, but I'll walk you through it. One of the questions is, and that relates to what Martin just said, there's different components of our consent, and the ethics board asked us to make this optional. So for patients only to be enrolled in the observational cohort and not given permission to see if they're eligible for an intervention and not given permission to use their data for the control group. And we thought about this very long, very hard, and we decided that we didn't want to make it optional. And the reason is that right now we're using all the observational data, but we don't know if we will be doing that in the future. And what we do not want is people to complete questionnaires that we won't be using for anything, because I don't think that's ethical either. So we went back to the ethics board, we explained our design, and we said these components are very important and that they are not optional. And they actually accepted that. As long as before they signed the consent form, we repeated all of the consent points in bullet point format, not check boxes, because they are not optional. That was that. That was something that made us think about the design and why we had chosen different things along the way. So the other question that we have you defined a primary study endpoint for the study? And that was a little bit hard to address at first sight because this is an ongoing cohort. There's no specific endpoint. Related to this question is, what is your primary outcome? What is your effect size? Well, we don't know. So we basically responded with a very general statement that over time we will be able to address many questions. And all questions will have different data points and different outcomes that we'll be looking at. I have to say, the ethics board, again, they accepted this. This is one of the most important things. It's also the last thing that we have encountered, is when sites, different enrolling sites, send us back the approval and the consent form, and we went through it, and we found out that all the information on the CMRCT design was cut out. So basically, they got approved for an observational cohort, which really is a problem if you think that all of it will still be in and you're starting to enroll patients in trials and this has been cut out. So what we did is we reviewed every consent form and every protocol before submission and after approval to make sure that all these elements were still in there. If they weren't, we put them back in with a rationale on why this is important. And it was accepted for all 39 sites. If you ever want to do a study, don't include France, because it took us 2 years to get approval in France, just as a side note. But we did get it in the end. And there was no comment. They were commenting on basically everything. We couldn't use the word scleroderma in our email reminders, because that may be distressing for patients who have scleroderma. Those kind of things they pointed out, but never any question on the CMRCT design. So that's the positive news. So some other considerations related to ethics. All sites need to have continuing review. So every year we need to resubmit our information. And what we're actually doing is that we are keeping track of when a site is due for continuing review. We send them a notification as well as a letter, standard letter that we have to facilitate submission at the site. Something else that we've been thinking about is, are we actually using all the data that we are collecting? Because we started off with this nice large data set, but now people are at their 7th assessments or 8th assessments. Are we actually going to use all of that, or are we just using the baseline data for them? So luckily we have set up a flexible cohort platform where we can add measures, take measures out over time. So one of the things that we are interested in, which is not in our cohort right now, is fear of progression of the disease in the future. So we may be able to add that in, take some other measures out, which we've actually done. Well, we actually took out some measures, but we haven't put new ones in because we have to go to 39 centers with an amendment for each questionnaire that we want to put in. But we spoke to our ethics board and we actually asked them, would it be acceptable if we just submit one big package of questionnaires that we may be using in the cohort over time and get permission to do that? And they said that it would be probably would be acceptable to the ethics committees. So we're in the process of putting together that package and then submitting it to 39 sites as an amendment.
It's very difficult though, isn't it? Because they can't assess the burden, because you might put a package
Right.
of 50 measures
Mm-hmm.
in, and they later on you might decide to do all 50
Right.
for some crazy reason.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one of the things that we want to do is put a statement there that it would never be more than 20 minutes total or something like that. Yeah, yeah.
How many questions do you ask right now?
So we started off with, we have 2 different packages of questionnaires. So one of them is we call it the big pack. They get it every 6 months, and it's about 20-25 minutes to complete. Then we have the 3-month assessments, which we really need because it's a primary outcome for interventions. It's basically a filler of 5-minute questionnaires. So yeah, that's what we have right now. We cut out quite a bit, so the big pack now is back to 10 or 12 minutes as well.
And that's online?
That's online, yeah.
I mean, just in general, often I really don't. My impression, having done this a lot at MSK, is that everyone looks at the number of minutes and then think, well, that's not very long. That's, patients got this terrible disease. What's 20 minutes? But that's not how people think. They just have this. They're like, oh God, it took 2 hours. Can't be doing that, right?
Right.
And certainly, the one that said 5 minutes that you're giving just a small one. People will do a big one at first. If you say we're going to ask you a long questionnaire, it's going to be hell, but then we've got all the information we know, and that will get you in the cohort. But the follow-up questionnaires, we try and keep them less than 20 questions. And we actually find, if you look at, there's some very solid underlying stats, is that if you ask more than a lot of questions, the amount of additional information you're getting from each individual question is in fact extremely small.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think for us, the things that are still in our package are the primary outcomes for our 4 interventions. So that is at least 4 questionnaires. So that that's the ones that we've been keeping. I'll continue. So that's another challenge that we're facing. So I'm happy to share that we actually got funding a couple of months ago for 2 interventions. So we're going to run the SPIN hand trial. And also after that, the SPIN self-management trial. We also got some bridge funding from CHR to keep our cohort going over time. So we're in that stage right now. So when we started to think about this, for the trials, we need separate ethics. And we really thought about going back to 39 sites to obtain approval for each trial. Yeah, and we were very excited about the funding, but not about that. And then actually Brad Thooms, who's the director of SPIN, had a brilliant idea on a Friday afternoon. And he said, actually, in our consent form, we say that the central center of SPIN in Montreal will be contacting patients to participate in the intervention. So that actually means that we only had to go back to one research ethics committee, the one in Montreal at McGill. And except for France, because they wanted their own little show, and they requested to submit each trial there as well. But all the other sites were okay with it. Actually, we submitted it too, and we got an expedited review process because it's a very minimal risk intervention. We submitted it on September 13. We got approval a week later. So yeah, we were this is exceptionally fast for our ethics board too. So going forward, and I think this is my last slide, is that we're going to run the SPIN hand trial. We're starting July because we have to do some feasibility work first to see that we can actually do this with 440 patients. And then after that, we're going to do our self-management trial, also with 440 patients. And the good thing about this is that, about the cohort RCT design, is that within 3 to 6 months, all patients will have completed their questionnaires, which will be used to determine if they're eligible or not. So within 3 to 6 months, we can have our enrollment done. And that is really something that we would like to prove in the next year. And hopefully in 2 years, we'll be back. So I'd just like to thank the whole team in Montreal. It's funny, my research assistant made this and put my picture too. As well as the funding organizations who helped us build the cohort and the interventions. Thank you.
Actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is, do you also collect clinical data? Or do you only rely on patient-reported outcome measures? And the second question is, you say, I'm so worried that we're not going to use all data because it's very focused on trials. But I can imagine that there may be other groups, people in the world, who have tons of ideas to do stuff with your data that you're collecting. Are you thinking of sort of making it open access?
Yeah. So to address your first question, which is, are you collecting medical data? Yeah. Only at baseline, and that is a limitation that we have. But that's so the physician, enrolling physician, fills out basic medical data in an online form, and once they submit it, that enrolls the patients in our cohort. We've been thinking about going back and getting more medical data over time. The thing is that for us, right now, it's not feasible, and it doesn't add much to the questions that we have, which is the psychosocial and rehabilitation stuff that we're doing.
Because in the context of the FIT trial, I can imagine if a patient is doing really, really badly or has lost all hand function, for example, does it still make sense to invite this person for a hand self-management intervention? So it may have actually consequences for your dropout rates in the intervention arm.
True, it may, the thing is that they need to have some hand involvement to be eligible for our intervention. Yeah. We have tailored our intervention so that it has videos for people with mild to moderate hand involvement, as well as videos with exercises for people with more severe hand involvement, but we couldn't know. And the question is, we don't actually know when we should exclude people from our hand exercises program either, because there's no evidence that if you have very severe hand involvement, you may not benefit from these exercises. Your second question is, can other people use the data? Spin is very open to people using the data, and there actually are quite some people who are doing it. Mostly they are either Spin investigators or investigators from the enrolling sites who are using this. So right now it's restricted to people who are collaborating in Spin to some degree. But if someone sends us an email with an interesting question and wants to use our data, we're very happy to share it because in the end we're paid by public money and these data are not ours. So.
I have a question related to the generalizability. So you mentioned how many people consented and actually withdrew, but how many people you actually approach actually say yes to participating in Spin?
Yeah, we haven't been able, unfortunately, to collect that data because of the burden for the physicians to enroll participants. So, I wouldn't be able to tell you that. One thing that we're currently working on is actually comparing our cohort with other scleroderma cohorts. So there's 2 other major cohorts. One is the Canadian Scleroderma Research Center Registry, and USTART's European cohort. We're actually comparing some variables, disease variables, as well as demographics to see to what degree this our group differs from them.
And just to add, I think you've been doing a wonderful job. This is truly inspiring.
Thank you.
So your consent form describes the study really well. How would you feel about adding the words "by chance" in right after the word "selected for an intervention"?
Yeah.
That's a good point, because yesterday when I was going through our consent form, I don't think we actually mentioned randomization or by chance. I don't think it would make a difference. I think we can easily add this in because we're not, I don't think we're implying with our consent right now that we have some kind of algorithm why certain people would go in and others not.
Can I just follow up on this point? I noticed that wasn't there either, but my reaction to it was, well, for this, it doesn't seem like you need to, and it doesn't bother me. If the intervention had been a new medication with, unknown side effects potentially or burdens, so that it would be a little bit harder sell for people to try it, then if you didn't mention that it was a randomized selection, I think more people would say, well, I think you should tell people it was random.
When should you tell people that? Should you tell only the people who have been selected randomly to be offered the intervention?
Well, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Because suppose you have a cohort in which you will do trials like this, as well as a drug trial. Then you have to sort of think, what should you do in your broad pre-randomization consent? What do you say? I think that's tricky. And I don't know what to suggest, but it seems like the intuition is that on a case-by-case basis, it could vary. I think many people would feel fine with this, but I think most people would say, well, just telling them they've won the lottery and they get to try this risky drug is a little bit different.